Welcome to my presentation, everyone. My name is Jade Sparks, and today we'll be talking about colonialism in America and how it has affected birth, specifically European colonialism, and then the push to decolonize birth. So let's get started. Topics we'll discuss, beginning first, is what is European colonialism? What do European birthing practices look like? Colonialization's impact on American birth, a brief history of birth in America, the lasting effects of colonialism on birth throughout history and today, and then the progressive movement to decolonize birth. We'll specifically look at a country that is using their government, such as New Zealand, to do so, as well as what America's movement looks like. I did not get a chance to interview Andrea Ruizquez, but hopefully in the future I can, and hopefully I'll be able to share that with you guys. So what is European colonialism? By definition, it is the practice of policy of control by one power over other people in areas with the aim of economic dominance. This, in turn, imposes religion, language, economics, and other cultural practices on the country that is being colonialized. This began happening in the 15th century. Why? Mercantilism, which was essentially to maximize exports and minimize imports for a specific economy. This, in turn, also promotes imperialism, tariffs, and subsidies. In doing so, the colonialist countries, also known as metropoles in Europe, they invaded countries for cheap labor, for cheap goods, and those countries that were invaded did not know that they were essentially being taken advantage of. This also kickstarted the African diaspora, which is a big that affected the American culture, American society. Specifically, we'll look at the UK, also known as New England, that directly affected American society, which is honestly the reason why America exists today. Also notable countries to remember that have affected other countries that imposed their colonialist views upon those countries are France, Spain, Germany, Portugal, Italy, many of those European countries that ended up influencing the rest of the world. So what specifically did European birthing practices look like? Well, this is specifically in New England. The midwife was the predominant birthing attendant. It was very women-led, and they were not considered medical professionals. Rather, they were considered spiritual healers in a sense. Birth and midwifery was considered a spiritual event. This is all prior to the 1700s. There were also lingering superstitions from the Middle Ages where midwives were considered, some were viewed as witches because they did use remedies that helped women not feel pain during birth, and some people thought this was an obscure event. Some midwifery licensure in the American colonies were required, but it wasn't like you had to have a paper. It was just beginning this process of licensure. It was optional, and this was normally done through an apprenticeship. So already beginning this thought of needing to have credentials in order to practice this skill. And most midwives felt obligated to treat the poor. Now moving forward to the 1700s, we have the occurrence of the first man midwife, William Smellie. This was the first introduction to medical practices and institutionalizing birth. Smellie began the trend of observing birth as a scientific event. So he looked at the anatomy of birth. He looked at tools that could help aid in birth, instruments that could help aid in the delivery of a child and help with the pain of a mother. So moving away from these more natural remedies and using more scientific, medical technology, these tools to help assist with the birthing process. And many tools that he brought into play, you can see now today. And we'll talk about that a bit later in this presentation. He was also the first to teach obstetrics and midwifery on a scientific basis. So in 1752, he created the Treatise on the Theory of and Practice of Midwifery. In this, he introduced obstetrical forceps. He talked about the anatomy of birth, many different scientific concepts. He also talked about the standards of differentiating normal pelvic structure. So already creating this box of what a normal birth looks like, so that if something is stepping outside of those parameters, then more medical and technological steps will be taken forward at that point. More about the male midwife. They were also known as accoucheurs in Europe. Mainly, they served the upper class women in Europe and America during this time period. So as you can see in our picture, we have the birthing person right here labeled as B, and the male midwife helping deliver the baby. But you can also see maybe that's the partner in the back supporting the birthing person. And then she's also accompanied by some support people, maybe her family, we don't know, but definitely had a family support unit still. So that was not taken away quite yet at that time. Many people would get a accoucheur because they seemed more confident. They had a solid base in anatomy. They felt like they knew what they were talking about. And there was also bias towards men at the time, where men had this stature, so people felt okay, comfortable seeking out their knowledge. When in reality, midwives are the ones that have had this knowledge passed down for centuries prior to the surgence of the male midwife. Also, more instrumentation was used for difficult deliveries. They were considered to have advanced knowledge, and they were prepared for the surgical removal of a fetus. Again, referring back to the pelvic structure. If something wasn't considered abnormal, then that's when we have this obstetrical use. How did America adopt these practices? Well, our midwives, you can see again the support people here, the person in the back, maybe their partner, and then this looks like a female midwife, but I can't be sure. But you still have the midwife and the support people around in this picture. And this is what it looked like in America at that time. Almost all women were seen by midwives in their community. Midwives worked with the poor populations, right? And they weren't forced out of work until the 20th century. We have a lot of midwives who are immigrant midwives or indigenous midwives at the time. And the way that they passed down this knowledge was through apprenticeship, through word of mouth, through family members and ancestors who had midwifery knowledge. That's how this profession was pushed forward in society. And during these times, women weren't considered equal to men, could not hold a job. They were meant to be at home. So what they did was they created this profession of midwifery. Well, they didn't create, they just continued this profession of midwifery to tend to the other women in their community. And it was a way for them to, one, make money, to support their families, to build community from, especially because they were immigrating from different countries. So, how did obstetrics become adopted in America? Well, by the end of the 18th century, universities that included the obstetrics curriculum thrived. American institutions for obstetrics at that time included Medical College of Philadelphia, King's College, which is also known as Columbia University today, and Harvard. These are all top colleges today in our society, and they all started with an obstetrics curriculum. Meaning these universities began essentially for monetary gain. Many of these universities realize all women give birth. This is a way we stay current. And it was a way for men to take the field of birth. Because at this time, women weren't accepted into these universities. American physicians no longer needed to travel to Europe to receive excellent medical education. They could do it right in the comfort of their home. And this really kickstarted the obstetrical movement here in America, which led to the institutionalization of birth. So now that we talked about the practices that were, the history of the practices that were adopted, let's talk about some traditional birthing practices and what those may look like. I have a fun activity, so get your phone out. You're going to scan a QR code and we're going to participate. And after we do that, then we're going to look at how the birthing practices look like as they were medicalized. So if you guys can, go ahead and scan this QR code, and I'm going to ask that you kindly answer this prompt: known traditional birthing practices from your ancestry or your own historical research that you've conducted. There's another link supplementing this video that includes the word cloud for this class. Go ahead and click that link while you're answering this prompt so that you can compare your answers with our fellow classmates. That way we could see, you know, what things may have been taken away from the traditions of your own culture. And why I ask everybody to participate, because America is such a big melting pot of unique traditions and cultures. We all have something unique to share. And so did the women and birthing people of that time, where those practices were taken away from them. So how were they taken away from those women? Well, birth was medicalized. As we can see in the top left picture, this birthing person's leg is bound in stirrups and where they can't move. I didn't want to show the whole entire picture because it can get a bit graphic. We also see down here a man doctor holding a baby, which looks right after a surgical birth. We have a nurse. No family members around. I just see many medical professionals all around this birthing person. You can't even see the birthing person. It's just the baby and a sheet, which looks totally different from before, with everybody being around, supporting the birthing person, making it a whole event. So as we can see in this picture as well, a nurse is tending to a newborn baby, and it just shows that baby is not with mother. Baby is away from mother. Nurse is checking up on the baby, and it's okay to make sure that the baby is okay, but we have that separation, which in some cultures that was considered taboo. We also see the use of obstetrical instruments. As we can see right here, gynecological instruments. This is in the book from William Smellie. These are tools to displace the uterus. We have over here uterine probes and applicators. And even today, this is still current because we still use uterine probes in order to conduct ultrasounds to see the baby sometimes. So let's review our key points: how birth became colonized. Well, first off, birth was taken out of the hands of community women and midwife practitioners. It then became required for licensure for these traditional birth attendants. So immigrant midwives, grand midwives, and indigenous birth attendants, which we'll go over in the next slide, who they were and what they meant for the community. They were now required to obtain licensure to help their communities and women give birth. The standard set to receive a licensure was set by doctors and obstetricians who have a different way of viewing birth. So it was very hard and difficult for some of these women to receive that licensure, especially when there weren't modes to do so. We also see a forced stripping of culture to assimilate to the Western society or the American way. Many of the people who came to America, they dropped their birthing practices, their traditional birthing practices, to give birth in a hospital because it was considered posh. It was considered, the upscale thing to do. If you could afford to give birth in a hospital, you were doing things. We also see birth institutionalized, starting with our education system. Birth was also medicalized, moving from helping a mother push a baby out naturally to saying if there are even the slightest bit of complications sway from a normal birth, that baby may be removed surgically. Mother may be put on opioids. Another point to remember is twilight sleep. Twilight sleep, women were taken during their labors, given opioids, and many women don't remember giving birth. Some wake up with a scar and realize that their baby was surgically removed. And during this time, partners, family members were not able to attend the births and to observe what was happening during the birthing person's labor. And some women may have been taken advantage of with this twilight sleep. Last but not least, birth became a medical operation, and it still is today. It is no longer a spiritual or familial event unless we make it one. Midwifery may have slowed, but it never died. We have our advocates for midwifery throughout the 1900s. And let's start off with the indigenous midwives, those who were indigenous to this land. During indigenous births, the elders in the Native American community who have experienced birth themselves and found a calling to give back to the community were the ones who attended to women. They passed down traditions and early remedies from their ancestors, and they truly worked to preserve the spiritual essence and the sacred act of birth in their communities. Then we have our immigrant midwives from the 1800s to the 1930s. These immigrant midwives brought their own expertise in birth from their culture to give back to the women in their communities. Midwifery was one of the few jobs that these immigrant women could have, as I had said before, so it was a way for them to also provide for their families. Then we have our grand midwives, which, says that they began in the 1800s to the 1920s, but they truly began when slaves were brought over here and brought their African expertise of birth to slavery. African American who attended births in their communities really cared for the women that weren't getting the care from medical professionals or other midwives at that time. And there was no way for them to have knowledge unless a doctor came and a slave master wanted to share that knowledge with a member of their community. So they were forced to just pass down these herbal remedies and spiritual healing practices and really lean on their faith during these times and lean on each other. Their influence in birth carried on till around the 1920s until licensure became required. And licensure was really hard for Black women, especially during times of segregation, times where racism was heavily prevalent at those times. And truly, the white man did not want the Black midwives who knew what they were doing, who have all this knowledge. They did not want these women to continue tending to the women in their community. So, what happened after the 1920s to the 1930s? Many midwives went ghost. That's why we call them ghost midwives. They continued to practice and gain their license without gaining any licensure after states began regulating the practice of midwives. However, if they were found practicing, they were subject to fines and subject to being incarcerated. Moving forward to the 1960s and the 1970s, we have our orphan midwives who honestly didn't have any expertise with midwifery. These are people who truly found passion in reclaiming their own birth rights. However, these women and these midwives consisted mainly of white women. So not including the immigrant, the indigenous, or the grand midwives that came before them that had these knowledges. These were just women who were not accepted into any professional program. They had no real mentoring in this craft, but they knew birth did not belong in a hospital. It did not belong to white male doctors. It belonged to women who actually gave birth, and they wanted to give back to their communities. So they practiced from the 1960s and the 1970s, and they truly opened the door for midwifery because many of these women then became organized midwives. In the 1980s, these midwives came together and formed organizations to progress the field of midwifery. Some of these organizations still exist today, including MANA, MEEK, NARMS, the CPM, and the NACPM. And this really kickstarted the field of midwifery moving forward. So now we have our modern midwives, 2000 to 2010s, and even present. They truly embrace this formal education and command, but they believe in a balance. So even though they're going to school, getting their licensure, they believe in this equal access and inclusion, and they're now working on initiatives to increase midwifery care to underserved communities. So let's take a positive look at the future of midwifery and birth. There is a push to decolonize birth. And what does this look like? Well, why do we say decolonize birth? It's the task of reclaiming the sacredness of home birthing practices, the sacredness of the home, the sacredness of the family. Midwives today are now passing down knowledge and education of these traditional birthing practices. So in the curriculum, as we see here at FSTM, we are getting that knowledge of what traditional birth looked like. Something that we're still working on at the end, we can see push for representation. It will be great to see this representation in our schools of the traditional birth workers. Although we're still getting that push, it's not quite there yet. We're working towards it. Also in the process of decolonizing birth is this stigma, this erasure of the stigma of unclean birth. You know, doctors used to say, oh, home birthing practices is unclean. You can't give birth in your home. It's not sterile. Well, we learned this year, there's no such thing as sterile birth, right? As midwives, we're erasing that stigma. Because that baby eventually will become immersed in that microbiome of that home. So might as well be born into it and be born with love and surrounded by family and members who truly love and care for that baby, rather than be born around medical professionals and nurses and doctors who won't be there for that child at the end of the day, the rest of their lives. So really pushing for this more familial support as well, if that's an option for that birthing family. Now we see that doula support is affordable for many, and specifically in 8 states, it is now government funded, where Medicaid covers the cost of a doula for postpartum and labor support. There's also no licensure required for doula support, so anybody can become a doula and support another birthing person. And we're now seeing funding available for this licensing programs. There's also a push for hospitals to provide options with their birth. So even though one may want to give birth in a hospital, they can do it in a setting that looks more like their home or a birthing center, that it's more welcoming, conducive, bigger space to birth in. Maybe they have a pool, birthing balls, things to help provide comfort. And now many nurses are getting trained in doula support, so they can offer that type of support. So even though midwifery care is not included in that option, right? Some hospitals do include midwives, some include nurses, but regardless, we're still having this push for allowing people to birth how they want to birth. Now let's take a look at New Zealand. What are they doing specifically? Well, first off, all of their birthing facilities are employed with midwives. They have a 3-tiered system, the tertiary being their hospitals, secondary being their birthing centers, and primary being maybe the home or somewhere else that is not a specific medical facility. Midwives, however, attend all births, regardless of the tier that a person decides to give birth in. And on top of that, they also honor their indigenous nations, as they understand, their government understands the detriment that colonialism has caused to their society and the marginalized communities that they've created. So in order to honor their indigenous nations, here's what their nation is doing. Te Ara Ohine. This is an act that aims to address some challenges faced for Maori midwifery students during their studies. This act was in place to increase the number of midwives in their workplace, and to ensure that the workforce represents the communities that their midwives are serving. Te Ara Ohine provides funding for Maori and Pasifika midwifery students to help them get through midwifery school so that they can be there to represent their communities. I think this is an amazing program. There's also a dedicated person who leads the pastoral and academic support to help actively recruit these midwifery students as well. And normally that leading person is of that descent. So I look at New Zealand, their birthing mortality negative outcome numbers are significantly lower than America's. They have been midwifery led for the past century, and they decided to put birth back in the hands of those who give birth. And they are looking at how to negate negative outcomes by allowing women and birthing people to be seen by people who truly care for them, people who look like them, practitioners that birthing people will feel comfortable with, where they won't feel stress. And they see that stress is a leading factor to negative health incomes. So it is imperative that our nation begin to look at other nations to see what they're doing, to see how we can provide these types of programs to have more representation in our communities, and also provide opportunity to have that representation. The National Association for the Advancement of Black Birth, also known as NAB, is truly working to have that representation and to address the health outcomes of the Black community. As a society, we should be helping these communities, assisting where we can, providing government funding, providing donations, getting the government to recognize who we are, to help advance the field of midwifery, because we all have the same goal, which is to negate these negative health outcomes, to allow people to have full autonomy over their birth, and to have options to build our communities stronger than how they were, and to reclaim our rights as birthing individuals. So in conclusion, when a country colonizes other people, they force those new people to assimilate to new cultures, thus losing their own values, traditions, and cultures. When the colonizing entity leaves or decides not to fund the advancement of a nation, they are left to learn how to efficiently adopt the forced practices to their way of living, leaving communities and nations such as our indigenous community, our Black communities, our immigrant communities, in a state of limbo, in between losing their traditions and adopting new traditions. This, in turn, leads to famine, lack of infrastructure, and poor community resources. As midwives, we have the power to reverse the current birthing trends by reclaiming the birthrights of birthing people in our society. Decolonizing birth and bringing the power back to the birthing person is the only way we will see positive birth outcomes that directly reflect, and correlate to autonomy, inclusion, and acceptance of the birthing body. Thank you so much for listening, and as a reminder, go ahead and check out the link to our class Word Cloud at the bottom. And again, thank you for participating and sharing some information from your culture or research that you've conducted throughout this history project.